Imagine a world where you have no alarm clock on your phone, and at the factory, a fine or dismissal awaits you for being even 1 minute late. How do you wake up on time when mechanical clocks are a luxury for the wealthy? In Victorian Britain, and up until the mid-20th century, there existed the profession of the knocker-up. These people were living alarm clocks for the working class. Every morning, long before dawn, they patrolled the streets of industrial towns, armed with long bamboo poles. They would tap on second-floor windows until they saw the sleepy face of a client behind the glass. The most skilled used pea shooters, firing dried peas at the panes to avoid waking neighbors who hadn't paid for the service. Who woke the knocker-ups? That was a separate caste of people, the knockerbacks, who woke up by their own internal clocks or lived at the factories. If you managed to enter the city without being late for work, your next challenge was the filth. In 19th century London, the streets were covered in a layer of horse manure, slops and soot. This is where the crossing sweepers came into play. Usually children or the elderly, they stood at intersections with brooms. When a gentleman in expensive boots or a lady in a long-hemmed dress approached the road, the sweeper would feverishly clear a narrow strip of clean stone before them. For this service, a small coin was expected. It was a job on the edge of survival and panhandling, where each sweeper jealously guarded their pitch from competitors. At night, the city became the territory of the link boys. The London smog and the lack of proper street lighting made a walk after sunset lethally dangerous. Link boys were hired to escort pedestrians from the pub to their homes, lighting the way with a smoky torch made of pitch and tow. However, they had a foul reputation. Often, link boys would lure unsuspecting wealthy folk into dark alleys where robbers were already waiting. Finally, if your home was overrun by hordes of rats, you called a rat catcher. The most famous of them, Jack Black, wore a belt made of live rats and claimed to know their language. These men caught rodents with their bare hands or using terriers, and then sold them for rat baiting, another insane entertainment of that era. If you thought being a street sweeper was the bottom of the barrel, you've clearly never heard of the toshers. These were the elite treasure hunters of the London sewers. In the mid-19th century, before the modern drainage system, London's sewers were foul brick tunnels flowing directly into the Thames. Toshers entered these tunnels at low tide, armed with lanterns and long hooked poles. Waist-deep in sewage, they searched for anything that might have fallen down the drain. Coins, silver cutlery, scraps of copper wire, or bones. Despite the risk of suffocating from methane or being eaten alive by massive rat colonies, an experienced tosher could earn more in a night than an average laborer earned in a week. It was a dangerous, stinking, but incredibly lucrative job for those who had no sense of smell. Closer to the light, on the banks of the Thames itself, worked the Mudlarks. These were usually children aged 6 to 15 or destitute elderly folk. When the river receded at low tide, they stepped onto the exposed bed, sinking knee-deep into sticky black mud. Their goal was pieces of coal fallen from barges, nails, ropes, or scrap iron. Unlike toshers, Mudlarks rarely found gold, but their labor was critical for the survival of families in the East End slums. Walking barefoot over glass and sharp debris, they collected anything that could be resold to junk dealers. Today, mudlarking has become a hobby for historians, but back then, it was a brutal battle for a crust of bread in the river muck. But the most absurd and unpleasant profession in this category was the pure finder. The word pure sounds ironic because these people actually collected dog droppings. Why? In Victorian Britain, the tanning industry was booming, and dog excrement was an indispensable ingredient for tanning leather, making it soft and supple. Collectors walked the streets with buckets, gathering the raw material and selling it to the tanneries of Bermondsey. Those who wanted to earn more wore a single glove to ensure they didn't miss the valuable goods. Finally, there were the dustmen. Do not confuse them with modern trash collectors. They only collected ash from fireplaces. In the coal era, ash was a precious resource for brickmaking. Dustmen were among the first recycling kings, turning heating waste into construction material for the growing empire. In the Victorian era, medicine was advancing in leaps and bounds, but anatomy schools were desperately short of material for teaching. Thus emerged one of the most gruesome professions, the Resurrectionists, body snatchers. Since the law only permitted the dissection of executed criminals, the demand for corpses far outstripped the supply. Under the cover of night, these men crept into graveyards, masterfully excavated fresh graves, and delivered the bodies to surgeons for a black market fee. This led to genuine paranoia among the public. The wealthy began installing iron cages called mort safes over graves. But while the resurrectionists dealt with the body, the sin-eater dealt with the soul. This was a village pauper called to a deceased person's bedside. A piece of bread and a bowl of beer were placed over the body. It was believed the food absorbed the sins of the dead. The sin-eater would consume them, ritually taking the guilt upon himself so the deceased could enter heaven. For this, he received a pittance and became a social outcast. For those who were still alive but needed blood purification, there were the leech collectors. These were usually poor women who waded through marshes with bare legs. They didn't use nets. They used their own bodies as bait. The leeches would latch onto their skin, and the women would carefully pick them off into jars to sell to apothecaries. Due to constant blood loss and infections from swamp water, leech collectors often looked like pale ghosts and rarely lived to an old age. It was a job where you literally paid with your health for every penny earned. However, the weirdest job in British history was at the very top of the social ladder. The groom of the stool was no joke. It was the most prestigious position at the king's court. The duties of this high-ranking nobleman included assisting the monarch in the toilet and monitoring his natural processes. Why was there a queue of dukes and earls for this role? Because it provided exclusive access to the king's ear during his most intimate moments. While the king sat on his portable close stool, the groom could whisper a request for an appointment or complain about enemies. He was a man who knew all the state secrets, simply because he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty in the royal latrine. The Industrial Revolution made Britain the wealthiest country in the world, but its foundation was built on the back-breaking labor of those called piecers. Usually children as young as 5, they worked in massive textile mills. Their task was lethally dangerous. While the enormous spinning machines were in constant motion, a child had to crawl underneath them and instantly tie together broken threads. Factories never stopped the machines to save time, so one wrong move could cost a child their fingers or their life. The roar of machinery, lungs clogged with dust, and 14-hour workdays under the gaze of harsh overseers. Such was the price of cheap British cotton. No less hazardous was the role of powder monkeys on the decks of British warships. These were teenage boys chosen for their incredible speed and agility. During naval battles, they had to run from the powder magazine to the cannons, carrying cartridges of gunpowder. They were called monkeys because they scrambled up narrow ladders and through passages amidst the smoke and chaos of combat. If a cannonball hit the ship, the powder monkeys were often the first to go up in flames. On merchant barges, there were billy boys, errand boys who served simultaneously as deckhands, cooks, and cleaners. They were at the bottom of the ship's hierarchy and often the targets of cruel pranks by seasoned sailors. But the ultimate symbol of child labor in Britain will always be the chimney sweeps. While we are used to the cheerful image from fairy tales, the reality was horrific. Master sweeps needed small, thin children, climbing boys who could fit into the narrow, winding flues of Victorian houses. To toughen the skin on a child's elbows and knees, it was rubbed with salt and brine by the fire. Children frequently got stuck in the narrow chimneys and suffocated from soot, while those who survived suffered from chimney sweeps cancer, the first officially recognized occupational cancer in history. Finally, in the engine rooms of steamships worked the donkey men. No, they didn't tend to animals. They operated small auxiliary engines called donkey engines, working in hellish heat and cramped spaces to power winches and pumps. Imagine working in a boring factory for 12 hours a day. Radio hasn't been invented yet, and talking is forbidden. To prevent workers from going mad with monotony or starting a riot, tobacco and textile manufactories introduced the profession of the lector, reader. This was a person with a trained voice who sat on a platform and read newspapers, novels, or political manifestos aloud. The workers themselves would chip in from their meager earnings to pay the lector's salary just to hear the latest news or a chapter of Dickens. It was one of the most respected jobs among the proletariat, as lectors often educated the workers, making them more politically active. The spiritual sphere also had its specific vacancies, such as the dog whipper. In the 17th to 19th centuries in Britain, it was common to bring dogs to church, but they often started barking or fighting right during the sermon. A specially hired man with a crop or a long whip patrolled the pews, chasing out the troublemakers. In some churches, they even had special dog tongs to drag particularly aggressive dogs out by the neck without getting too close. Silence in the temple was their zone of responsibility. When it came to industrial might, niche specialists like the whistlesmith appeared. Every steam locomotive in Britain had to have its own unique voice, so that signalmen and station masters could identify by sound exactly which train was approaching through the fog. These craftsmen manually tuned massive brass whistles, achieving the desired pitch and clarity of sound. Finally, for this whole system to work, there were the knocker-backs. We already mentioned the knocker-ups, but who woke them at 3 a.m.? Companies hired special people to patrol the homes of the knocker-ups themselves, creating an endless chain of accountability. It was the living neural network of the time, where every person was a cog in the massive, noisy, and incredibly strange machinery of the British Empire.